To present the 2016 Milton Friedman Prize for Advancing Liberty, please welcome Nadine Strawson.
Good evening. I am honored to present the Friedman Prize for Advancing Liberty to someone who has been my hero ever since he burst upon the worldwide scene in 2005 with a bold challenge to the growing self-censorship in Denmark and Europe, and who has also continued to challenge the increasing self-censorship everywhere, including right here in the US. Too many politicians, journalists, and others refrain from candidly criticizing even the most discriminatory, repressive, and violent actions that too many Muslims carry out in the name of Islam, fearing charges of Islamophobia. In contrast, Flemming Rose continues to speak out, not only despite such false charges, but even more bravely, despite being subject to credible death threats. The same threats that have already been carried out through brutal murders of others who also have refused to stop analyzing, questioning, criticizing, and satirizing. Flemming Rose embodies the courage that is the cornerstone of our liberties, as eloquently described by another of my First Amendment heroes, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. As Brandeis declared, those who won our independence by revolution were not cowards. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty. To quote the concluding phrase of our national anthem, "We cannot remain the land of the free unless we remain the home of the brave." To be sure, it's certainly legitimate to shield oneself, as well as one's employees and others, from credible threats of violence. However, in too many cases, the reason for not saying something about the critically important topic of Islam is not fear of physical harm, but rather fear of offending some people's feelings. And yes, we should avoid hurting feelings, but not at the cost of stifling discussion on matters of public concern. Let me quote a recent Supreme Court case. You'll be happy to learn that a full eight of the 9 Supreme Court justices agreed with you. They upheld the right to engage in deeply offensive speech, which insulted many groups and individuals, including Catholics and the Pope. As the court declared, speech is powerful. It can stir people to action, move them to tears of both joy and sorrow, and, as it did in this case, inflict great pain. But our nation has chosen to protect even hurtful speech on public issues to ensure we do not stifle public debate. In stark contrast with Flemming Rose's continuing speech, despite reasonable fear for his very life, we have seen countless counterexamples. Self-censorship of even the most germane and important expression about Islam and current controversies, even by institutions that should be leaders in standing up for free speech, such as Yale University Press and the New York Times. Yale Press cut from a book about the Danish cartoon controversy not only those cartoons themselves, but also all other images of Muhammad, including the Gustave Doré image in Dante's Inferno. And the New York Times did not publish Charlie Hebdo's first post-massacre cover, featuring an image of Muhammad holding a "Je suis Charlie" sign and shedding a tear. These kinds of incidents perpetuate the tyranny of Silence. And that's the title of Flemming Rose's inspiring book published by the Cato Institute. In contrast, Flemming Rose's outspoken advocacy is promoting not only individual liberty, but also equality and safety, the very concerns that are cited by those who practice and defend self-censorship. But self-censorship actually undermines those goals. Equality is undermined by paternalistically presuming that all or most Muslims share certain attitudes and must be shielded from candid or controversial speech about Islam. And let us not forget who are the foremost victims of the violence and oppression that some Muslims carry out in the name of Islam, namely other Muslims. Moreover, self-censorship by non-Muslims hardly helps the many Muslims who welcome discussion and reform of their faith. Likewise, when it comes to safety, for that goal as well, succumbing to censorial pressure does more harm than good. Let me quote Salman Rushdie, another courageous free speech champion. How to defeat terrorism, he asks? Don't be terrorized. Don't let fear rule your life. And that point was also made by somebody who has anti-terrorism credentials, Bruce Schneier, who has been dubbed one of the world's foremost security experts. As he put it, the surest defense against terrorism is to refuse to be terrorized. Of course, that's easier said than done, especially when you have a price on your head. Tonight, we honor a rare individual who actually has lived up to this challenge, who has dedicated his life to freedom, not fear, as you will now see in a short video on the courage and commitment of Flemming Rose.
It was called the Cartoon Crisis. A Danish newspaper published depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, and in doing so set off an international firestorm. That decision presented a test to the very nature of a free society and the ability to debate ideas without fear of persecution or violent repercussions. Like many European countries, Denmark's struggle with self-censorship created a difficult environment for freedom of speech and the free exchange of ideas. That challenge was no more apparent than in Denmark's newspapers.
There was a culture of kind of chilled speech in Europe. People were worried. They felt threatened if they spoke out on hot-button issues, whether politically incorrect issues or critical of Muslims committing blasphemy.
In this cauldron, journalist Flemming Rose was hired as the cultural editor for the prominent Jyllands-Posten newspaper. Rose had worked for years in Moscow as a newspaper correspondent, where he witnessed peaceful demonstrators in Lithuania slaughtered by the Red Army. His experience had shown him firsthand that bans on controversial, taboo, troublesome speech were simply incompatible with an open society. At Jyllands-Posten, Rose became aware of a children's book author struggling to find an illustrator for a book about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. For Rose, the dilemma epitomized the overreach of cultural and religious taboos influencing public speech.
You weren't allowed to draw Muhammad in a children's book about his life, that somehow you were going to be killed. And the insanity of that said you can't impose your belief. And also that as human beings, we have a right not only to not go along with your belief, but even to say, your belief is nuts.
Rose decided to invite Danish cartoonists and illustrators to draw the prophet as they saw him. He went further, pledging to publish all submissions. True to his word, Rose and Jyllands-Posten published 12 editorial cartoons under the title The Face of Muhammad. One cartoon depicted the prophet with a bomb for a turban.
As a Muslim, I should say, I don't like the prophet being mocked, or a cartoon that ridicules the prophet or God or other prophets, by the way, or Jesus or Moses or Mary, which are all very, sacred figures for Islam. But the real question is, okay, I don't like it and I find it something offensive. The real question is, how do I respond to something that is offensive?
A delegation of ambassadors from Muslim countries petitioned the Danish Prime Minister Rasmussen to condemn the cartoons and punish those responsible. Rasmussen refused, and frictions escalated. The crisis spread across the Middle East. A group of Danish imams declared their aim to internationalize the issue. An Egyptian cleric called for an international day of anger for God and his prophet.
I don't think Flemming or anyone else, at least no one else who is responsible and grown up, is saying go around every day and offend as many people as possible on purpose. I think we all believe in a form of engagement that's civil. But the truth is that we don't agree on a lot of stuff. And a lot of things that you may believe and deeply hold may be deeply offensive to me. You can state them civilly, we can all try to state them civilly, but if you try to suppress offensiveness or offendedness, then invariably what you do is put the most offended person in charge of deciding what the rest of us can say.
The ideal Muslim position in the face of anything that mocks or ridicules Islam would be to distance yourself from that, which would mean maybe you stop buying a newspaper if you find it offensive, or if you don't watch a TV program if you find it offensive, or you don't talk to certain people who are maybe offending your faith, which I call a civilized form of disapproval.
Within days, protesters set the Danish and Norwegian embassies in Syria ablaze. The Danish embassy in Lebanon was torched. Violent protests from Nigeria to Pakistan left 139 people dead. Rose and the cartoonists received death threats. Newspapers were closed in Russia and Malaysia. Authorities in Yemen and Jordan threw newspaper editors in jail. It might have seemed that the tensions over the cartoon crisis abated when last year publishers of the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo reprinted the cartoons from nearly a decade before and added some of their own. Months later, attackers stormed into the offices of the magazine and killed 12, including the editor Stéphane Charbonnier. Again, for publishing mere cartoons, journalists lost their lives, and Flemming Rose lost several friends.
One of the most moving things that we saw in France after the attacks on the magazine Charlie Hebdo was French people pouring into the streets to say, "We are all Charlie Hebdo." And that kind of demonstration of solidarity really sends a very powerful signal to the world.
No one would have guessed that the drawing of a dozen cartoons would have given rise to murder, attacks on embassies, these demonstrations all over the world. And I think that that's a great illustration of how powerful these forces of censorship are and how strongly we have to act against them.
Flemming Rose refused to go into hiding. Instead, he publicly explained his decision in The Tyranny of Silence, his own account of the controversy.
I think when Flemming Rose and his staff decided to publish those cartoons, they understood there was a risk involved. I don't think anyone understood the magnitude of what was going to happen as a result of that, though. And that's what was really such a wake-up call about this.
Again, in a way, what happened with the Danish cartoons was just a premonition that we still have to have free speech. We cannot have the assassin's veto.
Amid attacks, murder, repeated death threats, and even condemnation from people who should be standing up for freedom of speech, Rose has remained steadfast.
In a democracy, you have many rights. You have the right to free speech, freedom of religion, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, the right to vote. But the only right you should not have in a democracy, and especially a multicultural democracy, is a right not to be offended. Because in a multicultural society, we are all very different. And this difference in terms of culture, ethnicity, and religion means that we also have very different ways to express ourselves.
In the face of a controversy that I think he never expected, he could have taken an easier way out. You know, he could be living a quiet life somewhere without controversy and, importantly, in more safety, more personal safety. And I just admire greatly the fact that he has put himself at great personal risk, recognizing the opportunity that he's been given to speak out in defense of these fundamental values of freedom of speech and freedom of expression.
It's called the first freedom, the freedom to test and debate ideas. It is the very catalyst for human development. Tonight, we celebrate Flemming Rose, a champion of liberal values and defender of free speech. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2016 recipient of the Milton Friedman Prize for Advancing Liberty, Flemming Rose.
I don't want to censor that applause. So, first, the certificate. The Milton Friedman Prize for Advancing Liberty 2016 to Flemming Rose, in recognition of his principled and courageous defense of freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and liberal values against official repression, murderous threats, and self-censorship, awarded this 25th day of May 2016. And now we go to the heavy lifting.
Thank you. What an honor to receive an award that is named after Milton Friedman. Friedman's classical books, Capitalism and Freedom and Free to Choose, helped me understand the connection between free markets and free societies, an insight that was crucial to grasp the nature of communist dictatorships. I want to thank the award committee, friends, colleagues, and allies around the world who have supported me defending freedom of expression. Some of them are here tonight. Some of them couldn't be here. One of them is my friend and free speech ally, Christopher Hitchens, who didn't live to be able to share this very happy moment with me. Most of all, though, I want to thank my family. Without the moral and intellectual support and love from the individuals that mean most to me, the debates and controversies of the past 10 years would have been far more difficult to endure. To receive the Milton Friedman Prize is also a great honor because it is associated with the names of the former recipients, all great champions of liberty. I want to ponder a question. What is the best possible and most sustainable defense of free speech across cultures and history? More specifically, in this context, I want to challenge what is probably the most popular metaphor used to defend free speech in the United States, the marketplace of ideas. It was introduced by the legendary Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in the fall of 1919 in a historic dissent in which Holmes broke with his previous decisions, defending severe limitations on opinions and speech, even with the help of the clear and present danger test that later paved the way for the best protection of speech anywhere in the world. In that dissent, Holmes said, and I quote, "The ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas. The best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which their wishes safely can be carried out." End of quote. The same argument for free speech was made by Milton Friedman. The marketplace metaphor understands free speech as a mechanism to achieve a goal. It renders our defense of free speech problematic when the goal, in this case truth-seeking, itself is challenged. The comparison between an ideas marketplace and a real marketplace suggests that the markets for ideas should be highly restricted. After all, existing markets are rife with government interventions, restraints, regulations, and taxes. The marketplace metaphor implies far more exclusions from the domain of legitimate speech than perhaps even Holmes intended. And what about the argument from truth? Personally, I find truth-seeking an admirable and important goal, but many would beg to disagree. A government might decide that it is less important than equality or multiculturalism, which European hate speech laws assert. People can be convicted of hate speech even if they can prove that they are speaking the truth. If the only justification for free speech is that it helps society obtain the truth, then society may decide that it does not want to prioritize discovery of the truth. Most people are not truth seekers. They are affected by biases, and they do not necessarily want to find truth. Participation in public debate is rarely about open-minded pursuit of truth. Most people consume information according to their pre-existing preferences rather than information that challenges them. I think that we need to defend and value free speech, not so much because of what it achieves, but rather for what it is. Free speech is a right. It's a matter of individual agency, an element of individual autonomy that precedes government and the political and social order of society. It's about who we are as human beings. Speech is not just one among many human attributes. It is a defining attribute of the human. With the freedom to speak, an individual is free. Without that freedom, an individual is not free. Of course, the freedom to say something doesn't imply that it is always prudent to do so. The problem is, who is to decide what speech is responsible and what speech is irresponsible? Prudence would have counseled Abraham Lincoln to be polite about slaveholders, but instead he suggested they were racists and rapists. Lincoln stood for the proposition that the free are not free to choose on freedom. He rooted this an argument about what the founders really meant about equality. We easily get into trouble if our defense of free speech is premised on whether it contributes to truth-seeking or not, whether it serves democracy or not, whether it offends or not, whether it undermines the war effort or not, whether it is a threat to the common good or not. All these arguments are used every day to silence people all around the world. They are all instrumental or utilitarian arguments. They claim that we need free speech to achieve something else that is more important than free speech. If our speech contradicts these goals of higher value, that is democracy, theocracy, communism, dignity understood as the right not to be offended, the historical truth, religious sensibilities, the need to eradicate hate, and so on and so forth, then it is perfectly okay to criminalize that kind of speech. This is the fundamental nature of the position I am in favor of free speech, but thus, we need a non-instrumental or non-utilitarian argument for free speech. Freedom of speech is a good in and of itself. It has intrinsic value. Viewing free speech as an individual right rather than a mechanism to achieve a goal will lead to the conclusion that there are too many restraints on this liberty, while the position I am in favor of free speech, but always will be able to justify further limitations on speech. The argument from autonomy means that human beings are morally self-governing individuals that are able to make up their mind about the speech of other people and decide how to respond. No politician or public opinion should have the power through criminalization or bans to hide opinions and speech from us, implying that we are not able to handle it in a reasonable and responsible way. It takes away our dignity because it is based on the assumption that we cannot be trusted to listen to certain kinds of speech. As Lincoln assumed in another context, free men should not be free to choose unfreedom for others. This is where the arguments from autonomy and dignity are grounded and where they come together in a sustainable and enduring defense for free speech. Thank you. Thank you.